Hello, I'm Denise Schwab, and I'm the Extension Beef Specialist for Northeast Iowa. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about controlling some of our costs by controlling waste. And anytime feed costs are high, we want to look at everything we can do to minimize waste and get as much of that feed into the cows as possible. This is a study from Michigan that I like to talk about, and it compares 4 different feeder systems. They call this the cone system, so it's a round bale with a cone inside, a regular round bale feeder. The one down below here they called a cradle, and then the other long system they called here a trailer. And as they looked at those, what they actually did, some poor grad student had to go out and clean up all the wasted hay after every day's feeding, and they actually took that back and sorted between the manure and feed and then weighed it. And what they found here is that the cone feeder had only 3.5% loss, so it was very conservative. The ring bale feeder had a 6% loss. The trailer feeder had 11.5% loss, and the cradle had a 14.6% loss. As they talked about the explanation behind this and why they think they saw some of those wastes, what they said is with the cone feeder and the trailer feeder, it was a double bar system. So they had a straight bar and a slanted bar. And what they noticed is the cows, as they put their head in and fed off of those systems, they entered it, they stayed there, and they ate. Where the other 2 systems with a single bar, they had more entries. So the cow would put her head into it, grab a mouthful, back out, and wait for the boss cow to chase her around. So they had a lot more interaction between the cows, between the boss cow and the other cows, and that's part of the reason they increased some of their wastage. One of the other reasons I think has a factor, although it doesn't talk about it in the description, is just the angle of the cow's head as she's feeding. For both the cone and the ring, the lower loss feeding systems, their head was down, they would pull it out and eat it right there, and what was to drop tended to drop within that ring. On the 2 other systems, the cow's heads were up, and so as they pulled a chunk of hay out to eat it, they probably had more droppage away from that feeding system. They looked at it then and compared those 4 systems to feeding just hay on the ground with no round bale feeder. And what they found is with the hay was fed on the ground, no bale system, no kind of a feeder system, they looked at about 25% waste of that hay that was left on the ground behind after the cows were fed. So comparing the amount of hay wastage with these 4 systems to being fed on free choice on the ground, the slant bar ring, so the ring that was just a single bar, had about a 19% savings compared to feeding on the ground. The cone feeder had a 21% savings versus feeding on the ground. And then the trailer and the cradle were 13 and 10% savings versus feeding on the ground. They looked at it both a $60 and a $90 a bale feed cost, and so we'll look over here at the $90 a bale cost. And that was a difference of between $19 and $10 of savings for every bale fed, whether you used the cone feeder versus feeding on the ground or the cradle feeder versus feeding on the ground. So at that point, if you think about how many bales do you feed in a wintertime times that $10 to $20 savings, will that pay for cost of feeders and cone systems? We also, this is a study from Iowa State that's getting a little age on it, but it was one of the early studies looking at tub grounding corn stover, corn stalks. And what they found in this study here is looking at ground corn stalks versus unground corn stalks. The difference in waste was 17% where it was ground and 34% waste where it was just fed as the whole unground corn stalks. So by grinding that corn stover for consumption, they dropped the waste in half. But in addition to dropping the waste, it also improved the intake by 14%, going from 8 pounds to 10 pounds of the ground corn. So if we're looking at using corn stover as our major feed product for the cow herd, the fact that we tub grind it, we can reduce our losses in half and also increase consumption by 14%, which can make a big difference on those cows. Couple little odd notes I want to add in terms of waste. Anybody who's had problems with starlings, you realize the amount of feed that those animals can consume, those birds. But the data has shown that they'll eat about 2 pounds of feed per month. And they never come in ones or twos, they come in hundreds or thousands. So you start to add up the amount of feed that can go into supporting starlings in a winter feeding system, and it adds up a lot of dollars as well. Probably management is the one tool that a lot of producers can use effectively to help not eliminate, but control the starling problems we have. There's frightening devices, the cannons and the bombs and the little owls that hang. You can put wire pieces on top of your boards in your building to try to remove the habitat for them. There are a couple poisons or toxins on the market that we can use with some effect, although they do have some side effects in terms of neighbor relations. But probably the one thing I've heard farmers say as much as anything is where they're using a wet or a modified distiller's product, that tends to be what draws the birds the most. Folks that have gone to putting that into a commodity shed and putting a roof over it are saying that that probably helps about as much as anything. So thinking about storage on those products that the starlings tend to like the most. Again, we get the comment about not wanting to start the tractor every day, and this is another study from Missouri. It looked at a 1-day supply of feed versus a 7-day supply of feed, and whether we're using hay racks or not using hay racks, and how we put that form up, whether it was small square bales, large round bales, or haystacks. But what I want to direct your attention to is over here on this without a rack column, and where we see all these little stars here. By feeding hay, whether we're small square bales, large round bales, without a rack, we're looking at somewhere in that 12% loss if we're feeding a 1-day supply, or in this study up to 43% loss for feeding a 7-day supply. So again, the importance of putting that hay out on a daily basis to limit intake and reduce waste really makes a difference in terms of our feed cost. If we're looking at $200 a ton hay, that amounts to about $61 for every ton of hay fed, just going from the 1 day without a rack to the 7-day without a rack. So it really adds to the cost of the feed. And here's another table that looks at the impact of storage or feeding loss on hay. If we're looking at hay that's priced at $150 a ton, but we're looking at, say, 20% feeding loss, all of a sudden now what actually is consumed by the cows, instead of costing $150 a ton, is now costing us $187 a ton. So a big increase in terms of cost just by what we do in waste. If we can reduce that from 20 to 10% waste, we've now cut the cost of our feed bill down to $166 a ton versus $187 a ton. So just reinforcing the importance that really feeding waste and controlling feeding waste really does add to our cost of feeding a cow, especially with high cost feeds. If you have questions, I'd be glad to help you out with them, as well as your other beef specialists. We also have another presentation available on the web that talks about feed shrinkage and some of the factors that are involved with that. If you're interested in that, it's available on the Iowa Beef Center webpage.